In the middle of the studio, the producer asked, "Can this be played without the effects?" Ace Frehley froze. And everyone finally understood. The year was 1976. A recording studio in Los Angeles. Not the famous ones where the big names worked. A mid-size room with decent equipment, and a producer who thought he'd seen everything. Ace Frehley walked in carrying his Gibson Les Paul. No makeup. No costume. Just a guy in jeans and a black shirt with a guitar case. The producer, Martin Kellerman, a session veteran who'd worked with jazz players and classical guitarists, looked up from the mixing console and nodded. "You're the Kiss guy," Kellerman said. Not a question. A statement. The tone suggested he'd already made up his mind about what that meant. Ace didn't respond. He set his case down, opened it, lifted the guitar out carefully. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet. 3 session musicians sat on folding chairs against the wall, waiting. This was supposed to be a quick solo overdub for a project Ace had been asked to contribute to. 15 minutes, maybe 20. Get the part down, go home. Kellerman gestured toward the isolation booth. Set up in there. We'll get levels. Ace plugged into the amp, a basic Fender twin reverb, nothing fancy. He adjusted the volume knob, tested a few notes. Clean tone. Warm. Simple. From the control room, Kellerman's voice came through the talkback speaker. "You're going to need your pedals, right? The space sound thing?" Ace looked at the microphone. "What do you want me to play?" "The part we talked about on the phone. The lead break. 32 bars. I know the part," Ace said quietly. "Do you want effects or no effects?" There was a pause. Then Kellerman said something that would define the next hour. "Let's hear it clean first. I want to know if you can actually play it without all the production." Ace didn't defend himself. He never did. The 3 session musicians shifted in their chairs. One of them, a bass player named Dennis who'd worked on 100 records, recognized what had just happened. Kellerman hadn't asked a technical question. He'd issued a challenge disguised as a request. "Can you play without the tricks?" It was the question people always asked about Ace Frehley. The Space Ace. The guy with the smoking guitar and the rocket-launching Les Paul, and the makeup that made him look like he'd arrived from another planet. When people saw the spectacle, they assumed the substance wasn't there. When they heard the effects laden solos, the phase shifters and delays and cosmic sounds, they assumed he was hiding something. Ace had heard it before. In 100 different studios. From 100 different producers and engineers and session players who looked at the Kiss logo and made their decisions about what kind of musician he was before he played a single note. He'd never argued. Never defended his credentials. Never pulled out the years he'd spent in bars in the Bronx playing blues until his fingers bled. Never mentioned the session work he'd done before Kiss, the club gigs, the endless hours of practice in apartments where neighbors banged on the walls. He just played. But something about Kellerman's tone, that particular mixture of condescension and certainty, made Ace stop. His hand rested on the guitar neck. He looked through the glass at the producer, who was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, waiting. Ace unplugged the guitar from the amp. The room went silent. The session musicians looked at each other. Kellerman leaned forward. "What are you doing? You want to hear it clean?" Ace said, his voice even, no emotion. "I'll play it clean." He walked out of the isolation booth, guitar in hand. No cable. No amplification. He sat down on one of the folding chairs, the guitar across his lap, and looked at Kellerman through the control room window. "Right now," Kellerman said through the talkback. "Right now. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what most people never saw about Ace Frehley. Before Kiss, before the makeup and the rockets and the stadiums full of screaming fans, Ace was Paul Daniel Frehley from the Bronx. A kid who discovered the guitar at 13 and decided it was the only thing that made sense in a world that mostly confused him. He wasn't the kid who practiced scales religiously. He wasn't the one who could read music or explain theory or talk about modes and progressions. He was the kid who heard something in his head and figured out how to make the guitar produce that sound through pure instinct and endless repetition. He learned by listening, by feeling, by playing along to records until he understood not just the notes, but the spaces between them, the way a phrase could breathe, the difference between playing correctly and playing truthfully. His teachers were the records his older brother brought home. Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, Pete Townsend. He'd sit in his bedroom with headphones on, playing the same solo 50 times until his version and the record version became indistinguishable. By the time he was 18, Ace could walk into any bar in New York City and hang with players twice his age. Not through flashy technique or speed. Through feel. Through knowing exactly what note the song needed in that exact moment. Through understanding that the best players aren't the ones who play the most, they're the ones who play what belongs. When Kiss happened, when Gene and Paul found him and the band took off and suddenly there were costumes and pyrotechnics and a character called the Spaceman to inhabit, Ace didn't resist. He understood spectacle. He understood show business. If people wanted to see rockets and smoke and a guy from outer space, he'd give them that. But the guitar was never part of the act. The guitar was the one thing that stayed real. When he plugged into those Marshall stacks on stage and let loose with effects-drenched solos that seemed to come from another dimension, he wasn't hiding. He was translating. Taking the music in his head and running it through machinery that could make it sound the way he heard it, cosmic, expansive, otherworldly. But underneath every effect, every delay, every phase-shifted note, there was always the core. The melody, the phrasing, the fundamental musicianship that no amount of technology could fake. Most people never asked about that part. They saw the show and assumed they understood. Martin Kellerman was one of those people. Subscribe and leave a comment, because some moments only make sense when we remember them together. Ace sat in that folding chair with his unplugged guitar and began to play. No amplifier. No effects. Just the acoustic sound of fingers on strings in a small room with decent acoustics. The notes rang out clean and pure, a lead melody that moved through the changes with perfect phrasing, every bend precise, every vibrato controlled. He played the 32-bar solo Kellerman had requested. But he didn't play it the way it would sound on the record with all the production. He played it the way it existed in its purest form. As music, as melody, as emotional communication through carefully chosen notes. The session musician stopped moving. Dennis, the bass player, leaned forward, his eyes locked on Ace's fingers. The drummer had been tapping his stick against his leg. He stopped. The rhythm guitarist had been tuning. He set his instrument down. In the control room, Kellerman's arms uncrossed. He sat up straighter. Ace's fingers moved across the fretboard with casual precision. No wasted motion. No flash for flash's sake. Just the melody, rendered with the kind of clarity that only comes from thousands of hours of playing, from knowing your instrument so completely that you and it become the same thing. The solo built to its climax, a series of bent notes that sang without electronic enhancement, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, the vibrato adding emotion that no pedal could manufacture. When Ace played the final note, he let it ring out until it faded completely into silence. Nobody spoke. Ace looked up at Kellerman. Said nothing. Didn't explain. Didn't defend. Didn't ask for validation. The producer sat behind the console, his face unreadable. Then he reached forward and pressed the talkback button. When he spoke, his voice had changed. "Can you play that again?" Not a challenge this time. A request. "In the booth. With the amp. However you want to set it up." Ace stood, walked back to the isolation booth, plugged in. He set his guitar tone the way he always did, slightly overdriven, warm but clear. He added a touch of delay. Not to hide anything. To enhance what was already there. He played the solo again. This time with power behind it, with the sustain and fullness that amplification provided. It was the same melody, the same phrasing, the same fundamental musicianship. But now it filled the room the way it was meant to. When he finished, Kellerman came out of the control room. He stood in the doorway of the isolation booth, looking at Ace for a long moment. "I apologize," Kellerman said. "I made an assumption." Ace shrugged. "People do." "No, I mean, I've worked with a lot of session guys. Jazz players. Classical guys. Technical players. And what you just did—" He stopped, choosing his words carefully. "That was as good as any of them. The unplugged version. You didn't need any of this." He gestured at the amp, the pedals. "You chose to use it. Effects aren't a crutch," Ace said quietly. "They're a color. You don't use red paint because you can't draw. You use it because the picture needs red." Kellerman nodded slowly. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. Why didn't you just tell me? When I questioned whether you could play it clean. You could have said, I'd been playing guitar since I was 13, or I can play this in my sleep, or anything to shut me up. Why didn't you?" Ace picked up his guitar, checked the tuning. "Because talk is cheap. And guitars don't lie." Away from the spotlight, Ace made a choice no one expected. The session continued. Kellerman asked Ace to play on 3 more tracks that day. Then he called him back the next week for a different project. Then he started telling other producers in LA about that Kiss guy who can really play. Word spread in the session community. Not through interviews or press releases, but through the quiet network of working musicians who recognize real ability when they hear it. Dennis, the bass player who'd witnessed the unplugged solo, told the story at a session 3 days later. "You know the Space Ace guy from Kiss? He came in and played a lead line acoustically that would make most jazz cats jealous. No amp. No pedals. Just fingers and wood and strings. Kellerman tried to test him, and Ace just played. Didn't say a word. Didn't have to." That story reached other studios. Other producers. And slowly, the narrative began to shift, not publicly, not in magazines or on television, but in the rooms where music actually got made. Within 6 months, Ace started getting calls for session work he'd never been offered before. Not because he changed his approach or abandoned the effects or stopped being the Space Ace, but because a handful of people who mattered had seen past the costume to what was underneath. The paradox was this: Ace Frehley had spent years creating a persona built on spectacle and cosmic imagery. He'd become famous for looking and sounding like he was from another planet. And yet the moment that earned him the deepest respect from his peers was the moment he sat in a folding chair with an unplugged guitar and played 32 bars of music with nothing but skill and feeling. Years later, a journalist asked Kellerman about that session. By then, Ace had left Kiss, pursued a solo career, battled his demons, and become something more complex than the character he'd once played every night. "What do you remember most about that day?" the journalist asked. Kellerman thought for a long time before answering. "The silence after he played. Not the music, although the music was extraordinary, but the silence that followed it. Nobody knew what to say because we'd all just been proven wrong about something we were absolutely certain we understood. It's humbling to realize you've spent years making assumptions about someone's abilities based on how they look, or what genre they work in." Ace didn't gloat. Didn't lecture us. He just showed us we were wrong and then went back to work. Did he ever mention that session? Never. Not once. And I worked with him a dozen more times over the years. He never brought it up. That's the thing about Ace, he doesn't need to remind you. The playing speaks. It always has. What followed silenced everyone in the room. The Gibson Les Paul that Ace played that day, the one he'd used for the unplugged solo in the folding chair, stayed with him for the next 15 years. He used it on stage. In the studio. In hotel rooms when he was working out ideas. The guitar became his primary instrument not because it was the most expensive or the most technologically advanced, but because it was the one he'd used to prove a point without saying a word. In 1991, during a period when Ace had stepped away from the spotlight and was reevaluating his relationship with music and fame, he donated that guitar to a music education program in the Bronx. He didn't make an announcement. Didn't hold a press conference. He just quietly arranged for the instrument to go to a place where kids who couldn't afford guitars could learn to play. The program director called him to thank him and asked why he'd chosen to give away such a significant instrument. "It already did its job," Ace said simply. "Now it's time for someone else to use it." There's a lesson in that, not the obvious one about generosity or giving back, but something deeper about the nature of proof. Ace Frehley never needed to keep that guitar as a trophy or a reminder. He didn't need physical evidence of the day he'd silenced a room full of skeptics. The music had existed. The moment had happened. That was enough. In the end, the story of Ace Frehley isn't about a musician who had to prove himself once and was finally validated. It's about someone who understood that real mastery doesn't require constant defense. It simply exists. And when challenged, it responds not with words but with action, clear, undeniable, and impossible to misinterpret. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The last time Martin Kellerman saw Ace Frehley was at a music industry event in 1998. They hadn't spoken in years. Kellerman approached him during a break between panels. "Do you remember that session?" Kellerman asked. "When I asked if you could play without effects?" Ace looked at him with those same calm eyes from 22 years earlier. "Yeah. I remember. I still tell people about it. About what you played unplugged that day." Ace nodded. Didn't smile. Didn't elaborate. Just acknowledged the memory and moved on. Because that's who he was. Not the guy who needed to remind you he'd proven something. Just the guy who played guitar and let the music be what it was.